Asking public figures one simple yes or no question will reveal whether they are covering up vaccine safety signals. Getting their answer on the record will rewrite the past, and it could help steer the future towards freedom, not fealty.
I'm going to show you the names and photos of 10 respected U.S. scientists and health officials I've engaged with over the past few years. I have been urging them to release the results of a taxpayer-funded study to irrefutably settle a notorious vaccine safety concern. I've offered to redact their names from this presentation on one condition: if they can find just one among their ranks with the courage to answer this obvious question on the public record.
In the long-term follow-up to the CDC's original hepatitis B vaccine trials, was the rate of death and terminal illness significantly higher in the vaccinated participants versus the unvaccinated participants given a placebo?
My aim is to convince you that a small group of elite scientists whose salaries are paid by you has no right to withhold the data that lawfully belongs to you simply because they've decided you can't handle the truth. Once you understand the incredible events surrounding this data, you'll understand why getting them to answer on the record is a mountain I am absolutely willing to die on. It will not only settle vaccine safety concerns, it is actually our best hope at halting the global march towards surveillance, censorship, and centralized control. Okay, that's a bold claim, but with so much at stake, please hear me out. At the center of this controversy is Dr. Paul Offit, named Time Magazine's vaccine champion. Listen to Dr. Offit explain why, despite the significantly increased risk of vaccinating post-COVID recovery, he and a small group of experts still forced those of us with natural immunity to comply.
In February of 2022, I was asked with 3 other immunology virology types to participate in a conference call about whether or not natural infection should count as a vaccine. That meeting was held with Rochelle Walensky, Tony Fauci. We voted on it, and it was sort of 2-2, basically. I mean, I was one of I think natural infection should count for obvious reasons. I mean, actually, you're making an immune response to all 4 viral proteins. You, in many ways, make a broader cytotoxic T cell response. I think you're better off in many ways. While we all basically agreed, I think that it should count, that the question was bureaucratically, would it work? Because I was already getting out there saying, I think we should target high-risk groups, where I was getting a lot of pushback from public health people who felt that I had gotten off the bus. Because, see, that was the whole feeling in this. You're either on the bus or off the bus, and there was no in between. So I'd gotten off the bus. I said, Tony, am I wrong? Am I wrong in making it? He said, no, you're right. We should target high-risk groups. He said, the problem is, the minute you say that, it becomes a nuanced message. And a nuanced message is a garbled message. If you really want to make sure those groups get vaccinated, then you recommend it for everybody. And okay, so
where I live in Colombia, natural immunity did count. My recent and severe bout of COVID exempted me from mandates. However, to work on a project in the US, neither natural immunity nor Colombia's traditional inactivated viral vaccines counted. I was forced to get the mRNA shot. I complied. Hours later, I suffered an extreme inflammatory reaction that crushed my inner ear, leaving me with permanent hearing loss and cardiac damage. A couple of months later, it triggered shingles, causing nerve damage. And years later, my hands and feet are still painful blocks of ice. Since Dr. Offit confessed to his natural immunity deception that many of us blame for our COVID vaccine injuries, we have to ask, what about the other vaccines? In his book, Offit reveals that the original hepatitis B vaccine similarly used novel technology and was actually abandoned due to widespread accusations of harm. He insists those concerns were proven invalid because the CDC tested that vaccine in a gold standard, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. He writes that in the 10-year follow-up, quote, there was no difference in adverse outcomes between those who, quote, had or hadn't received Merck's vaccine. That sounds like proof that the fears were invalid and the original vaccine was as safe as the placebo. Based on that reasoning, the modern hepatitis B vaccine was not tested against a placebo. Rather, the placebo in the clinical trial was the original vaccine, abandoned over supposedly unfounded safety concerns. Offit is the key figure, insisting that it would be cruel and unethical for a vaccine trial to give half of participants a true placebo if another vaccine exists that could be used as the control, thus giving everyone protection. That might seem logical, but it's contradicted by last year's documentary, An Inconvenient Study. It highlighted a Henry Ford Institute finding that vaccinated children are 2.5 times more likely to suffer from chronic health conditions. The Institute withheld their findings, arguing their retrospective study was less conclusive than a gold standard prospective study, namely the one Offit claims proved the vaccine was safe. But note the semantic loophole in Offit's ambiguous choice of words. He conspicuously avoided using the word placebo. Therefore, those who, quote, hadn't received Merck's vaccine may not have been trial participants. Technically, it could even refer to some unspecified cohort given a competing vaccine made by someone else. This leaves open the possibility that the CDC's trial participants given a placebo were much healthier than those given Merck's vaccine, so the scientists compared outcomes against an unrelated cohort given a different vaccine that was also dangerous. And that would mean the fears over the original vaccine were valid, and the flawed abandoned vaccine set the bar dangerously low when it was used as the placebo to test the safety of today's vaccine. It would mean parents may be doing the unthinkable and harming their children on the first day of life. Okay. I risk sounding like a conspiracy theorist for even suggesting our trusted health leaders resorted to such trickery. However, if they're being honest, then they won't hesitate to answer this question to eliminate the ambiguity. If they refuse, you can reasonably assume the answer is actually yes, making it pretty clear that they are deceiving us, and that the CDC's definitive gold standard study actually validates rather than contradicts the Henry Ford study, and that they are putting all children at risk to protect the pharmaceutical industry. After my vaccine injury, I wasn't giving anyone the benefit of the doubt. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request and have been traveling to meet anyone willing to touch this topic, including the involved scientists, their colleagues, and even their families. I'm dedicating my life to getting them to state out loud the answer they only dare whisper. Once you hear the backstory, you'll understand a yes would definitely rewrite history and have the power to reshape the future. So here's how we get there. Chapter 1 covers the critical flaw in the vaccine's design, and Chapter 2 explores the CDC's 10-year follow-up to calculate any harm. I will then confront the scientists withholding the data needed to answer this question. I'll explain how your life will change by compelling them to answer it. If you're up for a deeper dive, the second half dismantles their counter-arguments. This presentation prioritizes substance over spectacle. You won't see CGI graphics, talking heads, or opinions here, just a minimalist forensic examination of the scientists' own research papers. The only AI will be the narration. I am hopeful this will be the ultimate wake-up call, exposing the grave harm inflicted by the institutions now demanding the power to control what we say, think, and do.
Listen to Paul Offit and Anthony Fauci explain the hepatitis B vaccine controversy.
Recognizing that the source of the vaccine at that time was going to be blood from people who were carriers. They were infected.
Of course, you're handling blood that came from people with hepatitis B infection, which can kill you.
It required a whole new concept of how does one make such a vaccine safe.
He had to take human blood. He then had to make sure that any possible virus that could have been in there was killed. He had to take this one protein, hepatitis B surface antigen, and purify it.
He exposed the material that was going to be the end product to 3 steps that would kill any known virus, formaldehyde, pepsin, and urea.
And thus we had the so-called plasma-derived hepatitis B vaccine, a vaccine that was made from, no doubt, the most dangerous starting material that we ever used, that I would argue created the safest vaccine we've ever used.
You have the responsibility that you might do harm. This is not something for the faint-hearted.
Human hepatitis B vaccine represents the most technically complex of any vaccine developed to date.
Only he had the intelligence and guts and resources to do that. I don't think anybody else would have made that vaccine. It was on the market for 5 years, and it saved lives.
But the use of human blood continued to scare people, and those fears would simmer until they had cause to boil over.
A new disease known as acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, was first identified about 18 months ago and now has public health officials worried.
Researchers are now studying blood and other samples from the victims, trying to learn what is causing the disease.
It is spreading rapidly, cause and treatment unknown. It is a medical puzzle of enormous proportions.
When the AIDS epidemic broke, of course, that really begged the question about using whole blood in a vaccine.
The cause of AIDS wasn't known at the time, but the fear was that perhaps there might be contamination of the vaccine with whatever caused AIDS.
Use of the vaccine waned, and Hilleman was powerless to prove its safety until the cause of AIDS was finally determined by 1984.
Health Secretary Margaret Heckler made the announcement to a jammed news conference.
The probable cause of AIDS has been found.
And she introduced the scientist who led the team, Dr. Robert Gallo.
A test is available for blood banks. The reagents are available to characterize anything now, and a method is available to isolate this virus routinely.
Gallo and others identified HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, as the cause of AIDS. And Hilleman quickly showed that it was incapable of surviving his inactivation process. The vaccine was safe. But still, he found himself up against an enemy he could not defeat with science.
He was dealing with perception more than reality, and the perception was that HIV was sort of hanging over this vaccine like a cloud, even though he had proven clearly that HIV couldn't possibly survive the treatments that he had subjected that vaccine to. So ultimately, he had to abandon it.
The crucial point is this. They could have definitively settled the controversy simply by disclosing the rate of AIDS in the trial's vaccine arm versus the control arm that received a placebo instead. But they withheld that data. Instead, they ask us to trust the experts and accept that HIV could not possibly survive Merck's rigorous chemical inactivation process using formaldehyde, pepsin, and urea. It's true that HIV did not survive that process, but they omitted the key point touched on in Offit's own book. The costly pepsin and urea steps were bypassed in the version used for 30 years in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia after it was tested for 5 years on the US gay community. Offit's biography of Merck's vaccine head explained,
Although Hilleman's tirades were legendary, one meeting stands apart from all the rest. Hilleman's explosion resulted from the confluence of several events. When Hilleman was making his hepatitis B vaccine, he was adamant that his method of inactivation be followed precisely. If not, he feared that children might be injected with live, deadly hepatitis B virus. But Hilleman's research group didn't make the vaccine. Merck's manufacturing division did, and the manufacturing division was controlled by the unions. Hilleman, who demanded total control, didn't control the employees who made his vaccines. On August 15, 1980, the rumble turned into a roar. Hilleman found out that someone in the manufacturing division, in hopes of increasing production, had slightly changed his chemical inactivation process for hepatitis B vaccine.
Fortunately, there's a paper trail. In late 1978, gay men in New York and California began developing highly unusual Kaposi's sarcoma lesions, dubbed gay cancer. Note this critical anomaly. 60% of San Francisco's earliest AIDS cases were concentrated within one specific cohort, the San Francisco City Clinic Cohort Study. This cohort was established in late 1977 to archive blood samples from gay men to study hepatitis B in advance of the vaccine trials. Incredibly, While this cohort made up only a tiny fraction of the city's gay community, it contained the lion's share of early cases and was the epicenter of the outbreak. Within 1 year, AIDS symptoms appeared, and the men began dying the following year, in 1979. New York had created a similar cohort of 13,000 gay men that began years earlier, in 1974. From these cohort's recruits, men with no prior hepatitis infection were enrolled in the clinical vaccine trials, which began in New York in November 1978. At random, half received the Merck vaccine, while the other half remained unvaccinated, being given only a placebo. These would be the last major vaccine trials to leave a large number of unvaccinated participants, and thus the last to allow the gold standard long-term follow-up of vaccine versus placebo. In March 1980, the CDC expanded the trials to gay men in 5 cities, largely in California. Several months later, the same month that Hillerman launched his tirade, the immunodeficiency that emerged in that hepatitis B study cohort also began appearing in hemophiliacs who had received factor VIII. Investigators noted the only common link was that the gay men had donated blood plasma, and the hemophiliacs had received a pharmaceutical made from the plasma. They proposed the disease was caused by something injected. Understand, the factor VIII lots causing AIDS were made from the same plasma pools as Hillerman's vaccine. As Offit noted, against this backdrop, Hillerman was adamant that his purification process with pepsin, urea, and formaldehyde be followed precisely. To be clear, AIDS emerged a couple months before the Phase 3 trial, and none of the early AIDS cases were participants, nor had they received Hillerman's vaccine. Rather, they were in the study cohort, the men excluded from the trial for prior infection, whose blood was being harvested to make Hillerman's future vaccine lots. That explains his concern over increasing yield with a shortcut to the 3-chemical process. A few months before Hillerman's tirade, Russian scientists had claimed a serious problem with the vaccine was that, up until that point, it relied on only heat and just one chemical, formaldehyde. They warned the data suggested that formaldehyde alone may not be fully reliable at inactivating infectious viruses. They openly mocked the Western assumption that any harmful consequences of vaccination of humans would have been apparent in the chimpanzees used to make the vaccine. During the 1980 symposium in Paris, French scientists were on the fence. They candidly admitted,
"An absolutely and unequivocally safe vaccine has really never existed. Although hepatitis B vaccination must be considered more dangerous than other usual vaccination, until now, no direct evidence of any serious immunopathological manifestation has ever been established in our chimpanzees."
Scientists at Anthony Fauci's agency explained the critical role that chimpanzees played in this vaccine's development.
The chimpanzee model for hepatitis B has made possible the development of vaccines to prevent this disease despite the inability to propagate the virus in vitro.
Understand, in the 1960s, polio vaccines used monkeys. One maker explained the problem with the monkey model.
This monkey virus, called SV40, has been isolated not only from many batches of live poliovirus vaccines, but also from several lots of killed virus vaccine. It is clear that tissues obtained from the next batch of killed monkeys may contain more virus surprises.
Hundreds of millions became infected through polio vaccines. But the maker confessed it was impossible to prevent, because although the virus caused cancer in human cells, it didn't cause symptoms in the monkeys. Alfred Prince of the New York Blood Center explained why that wouldn't happen with the industry's pivot to chimpanzees for hepatitis B vaccine production.
The previously accepted distinction between man as human and the chimpanzee as animal is becoming blurred. Biologically, it would appear that chimpanzees differ from man little more than one man does from another. Serum proteins are so similar. Clearly, the biochemical and immunologic data provide little basis for separation of these species.
Prince was so convinced, The Manzi in his autobiography refers to his account of attempting to father a hybrid. They called these experiments, quote,
a way the chimps pay their dues to a society that is saving them from extinction.
In his 1972 patent filing, Prince revealed that he had added chimpanzee blood plasma to NYBC's human plasma pools. NYBC was a major supplier of plasma to the industry. Prince disclosed the unique antigenic fingerprint of this human chimp plasma pool. It's a match for plasma pools used by their customers to make vaccines that year, including Merck. Fauci's scientists dismissed cross-species risks, confirming the
immunological identity between human and chimpanzee.
Back in Paris, 8 years later, those French scientists voiced concerns over Prince's NYBC-B vax, containing a mixture of viral and host proteins. They warned it might transmit infectious agents. However, Fauci's scientists doubled down, insisting that
vaccine lots are non-infectious for transmissible agents because each chimpanzee is then carefully monitored for at least 6 months for evidence of infection.
The WHO backed Fauci's scientists and agreed that as long as vaccine makers used asymptomatic chimpanzees, they would be able to prevent a disaster. However, the tone was quite different when the WHO soon brought them together again in Athens. That symposium opened with Fauci's agency's chimpanzee experiments. By this time, the new vaccines were being tested in many countries. But they warned that much controversy still exists regarding the safety and new syndromes. In Athens, Fauci's scientists did an about-face, announcing that the new immunodeficiency syndrome might be caused by
viral agents that might have co-infected the donors of plasma from which the vaccine Hepatitis-B surface antigen was isolated.
They urged vaccine makers to find alternative sources that didn't use blood. Hillerman confirmed the emergence in recipients of factor VIII, highlighted the importance of adding pepsin and urea to provide further means to guarantee removal of viral material. Fauci would later confirm that chimpanzees are the source of HIV, yet the virus does not readily cause disease in its natural host. Like monkeys, asymptomatic chimpanzees also harbored a deadly virus. Yet the vaccine was built on the assumption that was impossible, due to their conviction that chimpanzees had identical immune systems. This 1980 symposium goes to the heart of today's vaccine safety debate because they still refuse to admit what is right here in black and white. The foundational premise of this vaccine's safety was fatally flawed. Warning signs were already being ignored within months of starting the 1978 trial on gay men. The New York trial scientist reported a flare-up in participants who had received the vaccine, but rarely the placebo, and said he feared being branded a murderer and jailed if, whatever the vaccine transmitted, proved to be serious. Now we know a flare-up is the sign of initial HIV infection that goes away during a 10-year asymptomatic incubation period. But since the flare-up went away, and the men seemed fine, they laughed it off. The CDC trials continued in California. The way Offit describes it, 5 months into that California trial, Merck's Hillerman found out that the 3-chemical process with formaldehyde, pepsin, and urea to kill any known virus had been slightly changed in hopes of increasing production. Merck's patent filings reveal the change. 5 years earlier, the 3-chemical process was detailed in this patent filed in May 1975. Indeed, 1 month later, someone else at Merck filed another patent detailing the improved process for faster and more economical processing, using only formaldehyde without pepsin and urea. It was not a slight change. Rather, it eliminated 2 of the 3 chemicals to kill viruses. And the CDC later confirmed the Russian scientists' warning that formaldehyde by itself does not reliably inactivate HIV. Offit's claim that Hillerman found out about the change before the 1980 meeting is demonstrably false. 6 years before the meeting, when the 2 patents were filed, it was Hillerman himself who announced that mass production was underway, expressly disclosing that the viral inactivation used the more economical formaldehyde-only method. Hilleman personally made one special lot, number 559, which he called a prototype, and tested on himself and staff. He reported clinical testing had been confined to this lot, handmade in his lab. However, the trials on gay men used lot 751, one of the many commercial lots mass-produced between 1974 and the 1980 meeting. It had already been introduced in Africa under the brand name HB Vax. Following the 1980 meeting, Hilleman revised his stance, admitting,
"The pepsin and urea steps in our process are judged to be critically important since they are highly destructive of viral infectivity and provide a backup fail-safe system for the formaldehyde."
Remember, 6 years earlier, he announced mass production had begun using formaldehyde alone, and by 1978, he'd already made 11 commercial lots even before the trials on gay men began. But when announcing FDA approval, Hilleman revealed those original vaccines wouldn't be sold in the US after all. Americans would have to wait for the newly launched production run, which added rigorous 65-week purification with pepsin and urea. He lamented that this drove the price of the new Hepatit-B to $100, nearly $400 today, making the vaccine too expensive for large-scale use anywhere. It was soon irrelevant in rich countries because just 1 year after becoming available, Hilleman successfully trialed the modern recombinant version. It was the first vaccine made from viral antigens grown in a lab rather than harvested from infected hosts. Within a couple years, wealthy nations had replaced blood-derived vaccines with the blood-free alternative, eliminating the risk of viral transmission. But it remained expensive for the developing world. When the trials on gay men began, Hilleman expected that original formaldehyde-only version would sell for the usual price, around $1 per dose. So, what would they do with the millions of doses made between 1974 and 1980 before the backup failsafe with pepsin and urea made the vaccine too expensive for mass production? As Dr. Fauci explained, in 1987, everyone was still operating under the mistaken assumption that HIV killed within 2 years, not 10 years. Therefore, because the men vaccinated in the clinical trials were still healthy so many years later, it would have seemed obvious the original formaldehyde-only inactivation had been sufficient after all. The CDC's Dr. Ryder explained what happened to those doses.
Those plasma-derived vaccines were becoming, HIV was just coming in. You couldn't use them anymore. But so Merck had made millions of doses of hepatitis B virus plasma-derived vaccine, which they were going to throw away. It turns out that in Africa, in West Africa, the most common cause of cancer in adult men is liver cancer. The idea that we would use this vaccine not to prevent hepatitis, but to prevent liver cancer.
The CDC's Dr. Donald Francis tested the FDA-licensed vaccine used in the US, which included pepsin and urea. He confidently assured Americans,
inactivation of the AIDS virus during routine vaccine manufacture. Vaccination with the currently available hepatitis B vaccine poses no demonstrable risk for acquiring AIDS.
But watch Dr. Francis's eyes as he talks about inactivation in the pre-1980 version from his trial.
Where you take a group at risk of the disease, in this case hepatitis B, and some of them get vaccine and some of them get placebo. It was all gay men. This was the old plasma-derived vaccine taken off of carriers of hepatitis B virus, human carriers, and then inactivated,
During the trial, Dr. Francis confirmed that original version indeed used formalin inactivation without pepsin and urea. In parallel with his CDC trial on gay men, the FDA also trialed it in Zambia, Southern Africa, targeting stable monogamous family groups. Opposite demographics. Same outcome. Just as in the US, blood samples were archived in Zambia in advance of the vaccine rollout. 8 years later, when the FDA scientists tested them and discovered those Zambian communities had been entirely HIV negative when their trial began, they questioned if HIV even originated in Africa after all. In fact, all of the tens of thousands of samples collected in West, East, and Southern Africa pre-vaccine were entirely HIV negative. The first HIV-positive blood samples in Southern Africa were collected during those FDA trials near the Malawi border, half from Zambians who had just crossed, placing them near these remote villages during the trials. Over 1,000 kilometers from any chimpanzees or known HIV reservoirs, these trial sites are the last place one would have expected the virus to emerge, let alone divergent, recombinant, and mosaic HIV-1 strains, including the new and deadly subtype C that would soon decimate southern Africa. Pre-vaccine, HIV existed exclusively in Central Africa, around Cameroon and the Congo. The virus had circulated there for decades at very low levels, and the rate of infection had remained steady for some time, with about 10% of Congo sex workers infected, and far less than 1% of the general population. Contrary to the mainstream narrative, Africa's first major outbreak was not in the Congo, then Zaire, despite decades of circulation. Rather, it was in Zambia. Although all of the Zambian communities tested were free of HIV in 1981 when the trial began, incredibly, by 1983, Zambia's hospitals were filling up with AIDS cases. In the span of a couple years, Zambia's infection rates far surpassed the Congo's, despite the decades-long head start. Not only did this defy expected incubation periods, Zambia's cases were not concentrated in sex workers or high-risk populations as in the Congo. To the contrary, the hardest hit were blood donors and medical staff. Higher education emerged as an unexpected predictor of infection. The leftover stockpile of the original, more economical HB vax continued to be rolled out across sub-Saharan Africa, India, Thailand, and Southeast Asia. Alongside Merck HB vax, poor countries also got NYB-CB vax, the one made by Alfred Prince that alarmed French scientists for residual viral proteins. In The Lancet, scientists asked if this was just an unfortunate coincidence, noting,
"Despite reassurances from the CDC, many fear that the AIDS agent could be included in the vaccine and be spread by it."
Many commented on the conspicuous correlation that, in 1977, the plasma harvesting began, followed by the trials, primarily among the US gay communities in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Symptoms appeared in the donors within months, in 1978, and when AIDS was recognized, the lion's share of global cases were in the US gay communities of those same 3 cities. While those are sexually active communities, one must ask why we observed the same correlation among the heterosexual communities in which the virus had long spread at very low levels. This is even more pronounced in African countries further south. In 1985, when an HIV test became available, Barry Shube from the WHO tested various demographics in multiple southern African countries and reported all were free of HIV, except
the only positive subjects were in the group comprising male homosexuals. The majority of these positive subjects had either recently been to the United States or had had sexual contact with other homosexuals who had visited the United States.
Just a few years later, AIDS was devastating South Africa. For the first 5 years, AIDS in South Africa was limited to gay men, spreading at expected rates, without a single case among black heterosexuals. But, starting in 1987, it ravaged black heterosexuals with unprecedented velocity, while white heterosexuals continued largely unscathed. If behavior was responsible, the epicenter should have been South Africa's autonomous black territories. These Bantustans were poor and entirely black. Instead, these fully independent reservations, largely isolated from modern medicine, were the safest places. Venda possessed the lowest HIV rate in continental sub-Saharan Africa, lower even than the wealthiest white zones. Across the border in Zimbabwe, almost half of new mothers were infected. In Venda, it was 1 in 200. By the 1990s, Venda should have been out of the woods. Through successful safe sex campaigns, STD rates were at their lowest levels. But in the rest of South Africa, HIV infections were soaring, even as other STDs like syphilis were plummeting. Then Shub came to Venda, and it happened in Venda too. South African magazines already contained ads for modern, blood-free vaccines. But in these black communities, Shub reported that the highly motivated apartheid regime offered enthusiastic support to administer the 1970s HB vax that Merck was going to throw away. Venda's infection rate immediately exploded from 1 in 200 to 1 in 6, surpassing even Zimbabwe. Fast forward to 2002. Shub releases this WHO bulletin detailing his plan for universal immunization in Africa. By this point, the WHO relied heavily on funding from Bill Gates. The modern, blood-free vaccines used in developed countries for decades now cost only 55 cents. However, to reduce the cost to a mere 37 cents, the WHO was still using a plasma-derived vaccine in Africa. The WHO's citation reveals it was still made using the same procedure described by Prince way back in 1984 when HIV was first discovered. For important context, Prince's biography and autobiography describe a bitter rivalry that began when Merck's Maurice Hilleman refused to hire Prince at Merck. Prince depicts it as a clash of values, describing Hilleman as the corporate titan making profitable vaccines for the rich. They paint Prince as the selfless philanthropist who wanted to offer low-cost vaccines for the poor. Prince's 1984 presentation, cited by the WHO 20 years later, explains. There, Prince presented his original lots, made from chimpanzee plasma. He cited this paper explaining that it was impossible to separate viral proteins from the chimpanzee hepatitis B surface antigens that provided the vaccine's protection. Prince warned the WHO that his final vaccine did still harbor cryptic serum proteins, and that it entails the theoretical danger of transmitting viruses. However, Prince reported that 8 million doses were administered without anyone developing AIDS. Remember, that was based on the assumption that, had the vaccine transmitted HIV, the patient would have died within 2 years. Prince touted the obvious economies if countries in the developing world made it locally from human blood. That would allow
the cost of plasma-derived vaccines to become low enough to remain competitive or even to be less expensive than the newer blood-free vaccines.
These books reveal how he devoted the rest of his life to producing the vaccine locally in developing countries, after a falling out with New York Blood Center colleagues resulted in his exclusion from the lab and chimpanzees. By the year 2000, the world had abandoned plasma-derived vaccines. But in 1999, the Bill Gates Foundation injected the project with a $5 million grant. Prince tried to establish manufacturing in Thailand, but
at the last moment, someone got to the Thai government to say plasma vaccine was not safe.
Undeterred, he pivoted to Burma, which is now Myanmar, the poorest country in the world. His biography states,
"One could not think of a more unlikely place for technology transfer. Burma's infrastructure was in a state of advanced decay, and they had trouble getting uncontaminated water in Rangoon, let alone doing high-technology production."
The irony is staggering. Prince was driven by a self-described socialist bias, hoping to help a desperate country bypass greedy capitalist pharmaceutical companies. But Myanmar was controlled by a brutal military junta. Instead of vaccinating their own impoverished citizens, the junta sold the vaccine on the open market to bankroll their oppressive regime. The UN, which had twice condemned the junta for forced labor, actually funded the project to
make it less than an unmitigated disaster.
To slash costs, Myanmar harvested their citizens' blood for pennies, and Prince piggybacked production of Myanmar's primitive rabies vaccine, made from the ground-up brains of rabid sheep. The WHO ranked Myanmar's healthcare the worst on earth, warning their vaccines actively transmitted the rabies virus. Prince's distributor, CJ Cheel, oversaw production. Other hepatitis B vaccines that used this method of inactivating viruses had already been withdrawn because of problems. Cheel resorted to misleading customers into thinking these were the modern blood-free vaccines.
Cheel Sugar has replied to this demand by producing a cheap vaccine. However, in order to arrive at the reduction in price, quality and safety have had to be traded. The vaccinee, and very often physicians are unaware of this, and someone presumed protected may in fact be at immediate risk.
You heard Hillerman call this the most technically complex vaccine, which required a costly 3-chemical process to inactivate viruses. You heard Offit say that only Hillerman had the genius and resources to do it, and that Hillerman launched a legendary tirade when someone at Merck tried to economize on the process that drove the cost to $100. Yet, Shub was able to get them from the world's most dysfunctional military junta for a mere 37 cents because no Asian country would touch them. During COVID, Shub touted his success, mandating these very hepatitis B vaccines on Africans as justification for mandating COVID vaccines, assuring us,
vaccines are extremely safe. They have to be because, vaccines are given to healthy people. So we make absolutely sure that they are completely safe as possible.
Shub cited a WHO report claiming they administered the plasma-derived vaccine hundreds of millions of times with no transmission of HIV. However, in sharp contrast to their public assurances, an internal WHO report concluded that every year 1.8 million people were infected with HIV and hepatitis by contaminated syringes. They downplayed it to not jeopardize their immunization programs. In the end, they dismissed nearly all transmission as sexual. Shub ignored decades of urgent warnings from Dr. Patricia Volkov. Since the early 1990s, she has been shouting into the void, warning the WHO that plasma harvesting is killing donors. We're told to make sure our chocolate is ethically sourced, but Shub made no mention of the source of the blood used to shave a few pennies off each dose. It didn't seem to matter that it came from a place where fathers are selling their kidney to feed their children. Shub did, at least, address the mountain of evidence in these research papers by David Giselquist, John Potterat, and Devon Brewer. They cite numerous studies showing that 2/3 of HIV infections in Africa cannot be explained by sexual transmission. However, this was summarily dismissed with this one-page rebuttal from Fauci's COVID origins scientists. They claim that if AIDS in Africa were spreading through medical injections, hepatitis C would also be spreading simultaneously, which it was not. They overlooked the fact that these vaccines utilized formaldehyde, a chemical proven to inactivate hepatitis C, but not HIV. Those widely used vaccines were never subjected to placebo-controlled trials and long-term follow-up, with one exception. Dr. Francis's CDC San Francisco trial on gay men. For that trial alone, scientists actually did perform the long-term vaccinated versus unvaccinated comparison that skeptics demand. Since Africans got the very same Lot 751 that Dr. Francis used in his trial. That comparison will definitively settle accusations that an out-of-touch global elite has been cluelessly harming the vulnerable people they thought were being helped by their initiatives. Has the greatest loss of life been wrought, not by tyrants and their wars, but rather by naive compliance with World Health Organization mandates? We don't need to speculate. We just need an official answer.
When the trial ended, was the HIV rate significantly higher in the vaccine recipients than in the unvaccinated placebo recipients?
When Kaposi's sarcoma first appeared in the gay community, Fauci blamed herpes, recreational drugs, gay bowel syndrome, and an unusual lifestyle. However, Skin cancer researcher Alan Cantwell proposed something far more disturbing. By bucking the mainstream narrative, Cantwell became the first scientist to publish a research paper suggesting that the true cause may be a novel infectious agent. Although Cantwell ended up being the first scientist to figure that out, Offit dismissed him as a dermatologist with uninformed views because Cantwell claimed the vaccine transmitted the virus during the trials on gay men. Offit insisted,
although HIV was likely present in the blood from which he had made early preparations of his vaccine, Hilleman's choice of pepsin, urea, and formaldehyde had completely destroyed it.
Of course, that ignores the key point we just reviewed from this same book. Pepsin and urea were added after the trials on gay men. Offit embraced a competing narrative in another book released at the same time. It blamed Canadian flight attendant Gaetan Dugas, labeling him Patient Zero. Offit claims that Dugas's legendary sexual escapades in gay bars and bathhouses placed him at the center of this CDC chart, proving Dugas infected the first 40 AIDS cases. Dugas, however, blamed the use of gay men's blood to make the vaccine. The 2022 edition of Offit's book still blames Dugas, but Offit ignored that our current understanding of incubation periods actually vindicates Dugas. All those men he supposedly infected developed AIDS within 7 to 14 months of exposure, 10 months being the average incubation period. Today, it's well established that when the virus is transmitted sexually, the average asymptomatic incubation period is 10 years, not 10 months. Sexual transmission was assumed because all but one were patrons of gay bathhouses. Granted, none of these men received the Merck vaccine in the trial, but their task force leader revealed that gay bathhouses were used to harvest the vaccine's source material.
The homosexual community were extremely good donors. They thought they were very civic-minded in donating blood. They thought it was their duty to donate blood and to be good citizens. And so in some cities, they made up as much as a third of the donors or donations in those cities, such as San Francisco. In fact, there were blood drives in some of the gay bathhouses because they were such good donors and they could get lots of blood.
Lab technicians described drawing blood in bathhouses.
This was utterly wild because sometimes the men appeared with their towels on and sometimes not. There was one guy who turned on in the fantasy room and somehow wandered down the hall. He took one glazed look at us and said, "Is this the medical fantasy room?" And in unison we shouted, "No, no, this is reality."
The FDA required those donors sign waivers accepting the risks from being injected with blood cells from other donors. Chimpanzees were being used as donors for vaccines sold outside the US. The San Francisco scientist who identified a link between early AIDS cases and plasma donation admitted she didn't check if all of them were donors. Notably, nobody has ever identified an early AIDS case who was not a donor. The CDC study, which blamed Dugas, found that promiscuity with over 1,000 partners was the least predictive risk factor. Even though Dugas himself blamed vaccine production, the study evaluated the risk for everything that went on inside those bathhouses except the vaccine maker's plasma harvesting. In 1982, 4 years after the trials began, hundreds of gay men were dead. Dr. Stevens, the New York trial scientist who had previously laughed off the flare-up in the gay men in their trial, said,
"None of the patients with Kaposi sarcoma were participants in the hepatitis B vaccine trial. Therefore, we do not think that the epidemic is caused by or related to the vaccine."
Dr. Stevens's denial relies on several glaring omissions. She never mentioned that her lab was harvesting plasma for the vaccine in gay bathhouses. She has only ever admitted in personal communications that the world's first known HIV-positive gay man was one of her donors. Even then, She failed to disclose that he became infected 90 days after her colleague, Prince, described hyperimmunizing donors with their less purified in-house vaccine made from chimpanzee plasma. We'll come back to that after the confrontation. She didn't mention if, as in San Francisco, the lion's share of early AIDS cases were concentrated in their own vaccine development cohort, from which they recruited donors. It's public record that every early AIDS case appeared exclusively in cities with such cohorts. Her denial is based entirely on the dangerous assumption that, if the Merck vaccine had transmitted whatever virus was killing the blood donors used to make it, then Kaposi's sarcoma would have appeared in vaccine recipients within 4 years. Pay attention to the critical blind spot. She did not consider the possibility that Merck's vaccine might transmit only minuscule amounts of the virus, and that this might result in a very long incubation period. When the first 2 trial participants did develop Kaposi's sarcoma the following year, and both had received the Merck vaccine, she dismissed vaccine transmission as extraordinarily unlikely. To defend this stance, Stevens started claiming that the trial vaccine included purification with pepsin and urea, even though those costly 65-week steps were added 2 years after the trial began. She also began retroactively referring to the trial vaccine as Heptavax-B instead of HB-Vax, conflating the more economical lots used in Africa and tested on gay men with the highly purified FDA-licensed version that was not causing AIDS. Recall that she had teased her lead investigator, Wolf Schmunis, because in an interview, Schmunis said that if the flare-ups in vaccinated gay men proved serious, he feared being branded a murderer and jailed. At this point, Schmunis had in fact been jailed in Brazil for deranged behavior and died. While alive, Schmunis explicitly documented that the later trial on dialysis staff utilized a newer vaccine lot than the one given to gay men. However, after his death, Stevens listed him as the lead author of papers that revised the historical record by suddenly claiming the dialysis staff trial used the same lot 751 tested on gay men, thus appearing to rule out any possibility of vaccine transmission. Stevens continued listing Schmunis as her co-author more than 2 years after his death. Finally, Stevens argued the vaccine was safe by pointing out that the AIDS rate was even higher in the men excluded from the trial, always ignoring that many were their donors. Stevens vehemently denied that AIDS was related to the Merck vaccine in 1982, 83, 85, and 86. The CDC similarly insisted the vaccine could not have transmitted the virus in 1982, 83, 84, and 86. By this point, it was moot in rich countries, as they used only blood-free vaccines. And in 1987, when the CDC salvaged Merck's original plasma-derived vaccines that were going to be thrown away due to HIV transmission concerns, the CDC assured those nations that the concerns have proven to be unfounded. However, by this point, Dr. Stevens could definitively verify. She was testing the archived blood samples from both her trial participants and their massive cohort of 13,000 New York gay men dating back to 1974. The most astonishing finding was that, even though they concluded HIV had been circulating in New York since the 1960s, every single man in her gay cohort was HIV negative until September 6, 1977. On that day, one of their plasma donors became the first known HIV-positive gay man. After years without a single infection, the moment they reported using their experimental vaccine to hyperimmunize their donors, 5% of their cohort became infected the first year, and half within a few years. However, Dr. Stevens claimed the blood tests exonerated the Merck trial vaccine because HIV rates were identical in her trial's vaccine and placebo arms. But she conspicuously withheld the comparison from the year the trial ended. Instead, she presented HIV rates from 5 years after the trial. She included a mere 19% of her trial participants, because she only included men who never manifested symptoms, thus focusing on recent infections post-trial. They are not only irrelevant, but also misleading, because the unvaccinated placebo recipients were more likely to contract hepatitis. When they did, they were recruited as plasma donors. The CDC could have easily validated Dr. Stevens's report, because they too were sitting on their own massive archive of San Francisco blood samples from cohorts that predated the vaccine trials. As Paul Offit confirmed in his book, the CDC only tested their samples in response to Cantwell's book claiming these irregularities in Dr. Stevens' papers were part of a cover-up. So, after nearly a decade of denials, the CDC finally agreed to conduct the definitive test to settle the matter, using the archived blood samples from nearly all the San Francisco trial participants. Because these samples were collected before, during, and after the trial, researchers could finally determine exactly when each man contracted HIV, and crucially, whether he had received the vaccine or the placebo. Their study revealed the magnitude of their miscalculation of the incubation period, the single foundational premise that had ruled out vaccine transmission all those years. 10 years earlier, one participant became infected in 1978 during the pretrial screening, a couple more in 1979. But during the trial's active vaccination period between 1980 and 1982, 42.4% became infected. In 1983, after vaccination ended, the rate of new infections, quote, dropped significantly and has remained low. But they didn't die within a couple years. In fact, only 2 even manifested symptoms a couple years after the trial. Remember, they had already administered the leftover stockpile in Africa millions of times based on the belief that none of the participants had contracted HIV during the trial, when in fact, nearly half of participants did. Yet, incredibly, almost 10 years later, 70% of them still remained asymptomatic. While the plasma donors were dying by 1979, and the general gay population typically manifested symptoms within a decade, the incubation period for the trial participants was inexplicably quite different. All the assumptions they used to defend the vaccine had been completely wrong. The obvious explanation is Dr. Stevens's blind spot. Plasma donors subjected to the process up to 150 times in 18 months died of AIDS within 2 years due to constant exposure to high viral loads. However, only minute traces of HIV had survived Merck's original formaldehyde-only process, resulting in the extraordinarily long incubation period in trial participants. They had the data right at their fingertips to confirm this. The trial's placebo arm wasn't just a control group for the vaccine. It was the ultimate baseline for the worst-case scenario of sexual spread. These unvaccinated men contracted hepatitis at one of the highest rates ever recorded, proving they were engaging in extreme amounts of unprotected sex with multiple partners while HIV was tearing through their community. If the HIV infection rate in this highly promiscuous placebo group had also been 42%, it would have irrefutably proven that the explosive spread of HIV was purely sexual. It would have exonerated both the vaccine and the plasma harvesters. Health officials surely would have touted that high placebo infection rate as hard proof that Africa dodged a bullet, and that no harm resulted from their catastrophic misunderstanding of the incubation period or Dr. Stevens's misleading papers. But imagine what it would have meant to report a significantly lower rate of HIV in that placebo arm. Virologically, their own research determined that hepatitis is 50 times more transmissible through sex than HIV. Yet, during the trial on gay men, and in the subsequent catastrophic outbreaks across sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, HIV was somehow spreading faster than hepatitis. Up to this point, the global health establishment simply assumed that HIV was inexplicably defying the known laws of virology and magically becoming highly transmissible sexually. A low HIV rate in the placebo control arm, a group representing the absolute peak of high-risk sexual behavior, would shatter that assumption. It would prove not only that the vaccine and plasma harvesting both transmitted the virus, but that these extraordinary, explosive global outbreaks were unlikely to be driven primarily by sexual behavior. Ultimately, such a revelation would shift the spotlight of blame away from the victims and place it squarely on the global health community. It would vindicate the conspiracy theorists and validate anti-vaxxers' claim that the lack of long-term placebo-controlled trials is obfuscating vaccine safety signals. It would mean their groupthink, blind trust, and anything but the vaccine blinders resulted in well-meaning doctors condemning their patients to slow, agonizing deaths. Yet hiding such results would cause a clueless WHO to continue spreading HIV in Africa and result in philanthropists slaughtering the vulnerable populations they aimed to help. So, if the HIV rate in the placebo arm had been significantly less, health officials would have to choose between A. Release the breakdown, thus confessing that they were responsible for the AIDS pandemic and that the lies to cover it up had spread the disease globally, or B. Withhold the breakdown, thus sacrificing the African continent to protect their reputations and the vaccine industry. Incredibly, nobody asked why they redacted the breakdown. As mentioned in the introduction, Dr. Offit claimed this very CDC study ruled out vaccine transmission. He wrote,
Researchers tested Cantwell's hypothesis by examining the incidence of AIDS in men who had or hadn't received Hilleman's hepatitis B vaccine. There was no difference.
Read his words carefully. By conspicuously avoiding the use of the word placebo, the men who hadn't received Hilleman's hepatitis B vaccine could have received Alfred Prince's. His ambiguous wording leads the public to believe a vaccine versus placebo comparison ruled out HIV transmission, while leaving open the possibility that he was comparing these two widely used vaccines against each other, and that both transmitted HIV. Note that, just like Dr. Stevens, the CDC pivoted to a comparison against the study cohort which suffered even higher infection rates. This gives the illusion that a vaccinated versus unvaccinated comparison found lower HIV rates among the vaccinated. We'll explore after the confrontation why that cohort was also vaccinated, making this a vaccine versus vaccine comparison. A yes to the keystone question would prove that the global health leaders demanding the power to control our behavior were faced with this difficult choice, and they chose option B.
I am speaking directly to you, Susan Bookbinder, Paul Offit, Michael Warraby, Harold Jaffe, Beryl Coblin, George Lemp, George Rutherford, Don Francis, Nancy Hessel, and Stephen Hadler. I have reached out to all of you. Several of you were copied on emails where scientists within your own ranks admit the massive explosion of HIV during the trial's active vaccination window was overwhelmingly concentrated in the men given the vaccine, not the placebo. Some admit the vaccine might have transmitted the virus. Now, most of you dismiss those, quote, unusual patterns as, quote, anomalies because scientists unanimously agree that the vaccine was safe. But that's because you withheld this breakdown and audaciously claimed this data definitively ruled out vaccine transmission. The scientific community is operating under the false assumption that meant that HIV spread at similar rates in your trial's placebo control arm. Let them know the truth. Only then can they evaluate my claims based on the actual facts. I have your emails proving that you ruled out vaccine transmission by comparing against plasma donors, not your placebo control arm. When I pointed this out, you threatened to pursue me for, quote, breach of confidentiality if I disclosed your internal communications. Some donors were hyper-immunized, likely with Alfred Prince's chimpanzee plasma-derived vaccine. That is why Paul Offit resorted to ambiguous wording. The bar for today's vaccine was set very low because that disastrous original vaccine was the placebo in the clinical trial. The Henry Ford Institute study corroborated this, noting that today, autoimmune disorders and neurological problems are 6 times higher in vaccinated children. The medical establishment discounts that conclusion based on the false assumption that your definitive CDC study contradicted rather than validated those findings. By withholding the data, you are denying the global health community the facts required to make an informed decision. If Henry Ford's findings are ultimately recognized, then every single day you continue to hide the answer, the permanent injuries of another 100,000 children are on your hands. You also released this later study showing that among the most promiscuous men in your placebo control arm, specifically those who naturally contracted hepatitis, only 9% had contracted HIV as of 6 years post-trial. Logically, during the trial, that rate had to be significantly lower. Therefore, it is a matter of public record that the rate of HIV was obviously much lower in your placebo control arm. That proves that even the worst case rate of sexual spread is far less than scientists thought. Something else was the primary driver. Yet despite this clear evidence that everything the scientific community thought they knew about AIDS was completely wrong, the CDC deputy director's written response to my FOIA alleges that nobody asked any questions after seeing dose-dependent HIV rates. Everyone just kept administering the vaccine, dismissing the spread as sexual. This data is needed to reveal what happens when credentialism, groupthink, and anything but the vaccine dogma supersede common sense. The Henry Ford Institute funded their own study, owned their data, and was arguably within their legal rights to withhold it to protect their pharmaceutical funding. However, your study was funded by taxpayers. They surrendered their hard-earned wages based on a fundamental social contract. They are the lawful owners of the data, and it will be used to benefit them, not weaponized to trick them into compliance. Your justification appears to be a paternalistic belief that the public cannot handle the truth and will stop complying. You are right. I would have never complied with the COVID mandate had this data been released, and I'd still be healthy. And I doubt Bill Gates would have funded the WHO's initiative to similarly force Africans to roll up their sleeves. Part 3 of this series will pivot to the harm coming from the other side of Lake Geneva. I aim to show that just as Africa was harmed by World Health Organization initiatives, Latin America has also been harmed by World Economic Forum initiatives, mainly digital ID, electronic invoicing, and central bank payments. However, that is more nuanced. To get them to consider it with an open mind, I need this answer on the record to show how oblivious they've been to unintended consequences. Think carefully about your next steps, because AI threatens to render you obsolete. Your institutions are quickly discovering that preferred narratives can be reinforced much more efficiently with silicon than with carbon. Why rely on you when GPUs can generate models to support any narrative, free of dissent, conscience, or uncomfortable questions? To remain relevant, you, the scientific community, must step up and reclaim your core mission. Embody Galileo's courage. Challenge orthodoxy rather than rubber stamping it. Prove that AI is no substitute for a morally guided human mind. You have nothing to gain by stonewalling and everything to lose if you do not get ahead of this. So here's my offer. If just one among your ranks finds the courage to officially disclose the breakdown and explain the decision to withhold it for part 2 of this series, I will gladly replace this confrontation with the data and a message that an official explanation is coming. Everyone else will be left out of this, and I will work with that person, confirming that I too hesitated to approach Dr. Stevens because Alan Cantwell's valid claims about her vaccine lot switcheroo were woven into wild accusations of a genocidal plot. When I approached her, I was sent supposedly leaked intelligence reports proving her evil role. The bizarre conspiracy theories made the entire topic radioactive, acting as a massive smokescreen that tricked investigators into discrediting themselves and repelled mainstream scientists. Look, spin control is better than damage control. You can explain the genuine confusion caused by the belief that dialysis staff receive the exact same vaccine lot as gay men. But if you respond with no comment, history will record that deafening silence as no contest. If you lie, feign ignorance, or try to silence me, then people will know not only the answer is yes, but many will conclude your deception is willful. Your opportunity to get ahead of this will have passed, and I will have no choice but to escalate. Instead of collaboration, Part 2 will detail how one of your co-authors, who was named in South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation hearings and genocide trial for their involvement in Project Coast, the apartheid regime's bioweapons program to eradicate the Black population. This will include an on-camera confession of intentional administration of HIV-transmitting vaccines in Black communities. Let's not go there. All I want is the truth so we can learn from history and stop repeating the same mistakes. To everyone watching, the time to settle this is running out. On all major platforms, this topic is already censored as misinformation. Right now, we can only discuss this on free speech platforms like X and Telegram. But this year's age verification laws will soon require us to obtain government clearance to access them. And we have already been put on notice that this will be used to suppress undesired narratives. So soon, we may not be able to touch this topic at all. But if we can force the release of this data before those laws take effect, we may expose the danger of allowing the perpetrators of this tragedy to control the narrative. Please consider supporting this effort. Your tax-deductible donation will fund a proper documentary producer for Part 2, giving it the professional production values necessary to encourage respected scientists to participate. I promise full transparency and that everything will be released into the public domain. The second half of Part 1 will now dismantle the CDC scientists' counter-arguments and end by showing that it takes a mere 60 seconds to prove, irrefutably, that the entire global scientific community is lying about this topic.
The CDC set aside the definitive vaccine versus placebo comparison based on the same argument Dr. Stevens used in New York. HIV emerged first, and with greater velocity in the cohorts from which the trial participants were recruited. Remember, these cohorts were established in New York and San Francisco to archive gay men's blood samples at regular intervals after testing for hepatitis. Those uninfected were recruited for the vaccine trial, and the blood of those with prior infection was harvested for pharmaceutical production. Even though HIV had long been circulating in New York, causing junkie pneumonia since at least 1973, none of the cohort participants became infected until late 1977. Simultaneously, on both the East and West coasts, HIV entered those cohorts, and within 1 year, 5% of both cohorts were infected, and in just a couple years, nearly half had contracted the virus. But this explosive spread wasn't reflective of the cities as a whole. Far from it. Remember that in San Francisco, this cohort represented only about 5% of the gay community, yet 60% of early AIDS cases. This chart shows how, over just 3 years, as the virus radiated outward from the cohort and spread to the greater metropolitan area, that extreme concentration quickly dissipated, dropping to 14%. These cohorts were ground zero, where, after nearly a decade of slow spread in New York, HIV hit these cities like a bomb in late 1977, with identical explosions 3,000 miles apart. Fortunately, at the precise moment and location of impact, this photograph was taken, revealing what the men were doing when they became infected. Rather than investigating the role of this intervention, the CDC used these men as a substitute for their placebo control arm. HIV was spreading even faster among these donors than among the vaccine trial participants. The CDC is arguing that ruled out any possibility that even a trace amount of the virus killing these donors had survived the vaccine's inactivation process. They are effectively claiming that somehow superseded a vaccine versus placebo comparison and justified the continued rollout in poor countries of the leftover stockpile. The newspaper described the massive plasma harvesting campaign as steady but boring work. These were the plasmapheresis centers that Dr. Dritz would later identify as the common link among early AIDS cases. In Pune, India, HIV prevalence among donors was 0% when one of these centers opened, and 78% 7 months later. Pune sits on the main highway to Mumbai, so it's safe to assume that many donors were truck drivers. Yet, in India, the WHO listed driving a truck not donating plasma, as a key driver of India's explosive AIDS outbreak. Similarly, in the US, the possibility of HIV infection during this process has never been considered. A donor's blood was drained into a bag, the plasma was separated out, and the remaining red blood cells were re-injected back into the donor. This allowed the men to be harvested twice a week for $7 a pint. Every year, this harvester sent 20,000 litres of plasma to Qatar laboratories for processing. This was a couple blocks from the San Francisco City Clinic cohort, right after it had been formed to develop the vaccine in collaboration with Alfred Prince in New York. This operation was overseen by Dr. Girish Vyas, head of the UC San Francisco Blood Bank, who, at this time, was also collaborating with Alfred Prince, but on a different, related product. Dr. Vyas and Prince had recently completed trials of hepatitis B immune globulin, or HBIG. The FDA had just approved it, resulting in a significant change in the way the plasma was collected from those men. Before 1977, quote,
"To most blood banks, anyone with a history of hepatitis is about as welcome as Typhoid Mary."
But that changed when the FDA approved HBIG in 1977, the exact moment the bomb hit the cohorts. Understand. A vaccine injects viral material to teach your body to build its own immunity. The FDA approved the first hepatitis B vaccine in 1981. However, 4 years earlier, the FDA approved HBIG, which does the opposite. It is a temporary shield made by harvesting infection-fighting antibodies from the plasma of already infected donors. Qatar Laboratories, one of the largest operations, is run by Grifols today. The most critical detail is that, even now, HBIG is manufactured by repeatedly vaccinating donors to keep antibody levels high during plasma collection. Yet, when the FDA approved HBIG in 1977, a commercial hepatitis B vaccine was still several years away. So, how did Qatar get enough antibodies from these men to make HBIG? Qatar simply made their own experimental vaccine. Offit wrote a book about how Qatar made a polio vaccine so recklessly that it transmitted live polio virus to hundreds of thousands of children. Offit blamed Qatar for vaccine hesitancy, calling their monkey-based polio vaccine
one of the worst biological disasters in American history.
He assured us that
Qatar Laboratories never again made another polio vaccine.
What he failed to mention is that Qatar used chimpanzees to make a hepatitis B vaccine in 1977 at their lab in Berkeley, a San Francisco suburb, when they needed a vaccine to hyper-immunize gay men. If Prince's chimpanzee plasma treatments introduced HIV in New York when they began in the 1960s, then the virus should have become diversified in New York by the time HBIG was approved in 1977. That year, Dr. Vyas would have detonated the bomb in San Francisco. He would have introduced en masse a single strain while hyper-immunizing plasma donors to make HBIG. That would leave an irrefutable viral fingerprint, specifically a starburst-shaped phylogeny or founder effect. San Francisco scientists confirmed that is precisely what they observed. Fauci's lead COVID origin scientist agreed the genetic diversity proved the virus spread in New York. Then there was a massive introduction of a single strain in San Francisco. Like Qatar, after Merck patented the costly process with pepsin and urea, followed by the more economical process without, Merck similarly patented a third, special version of their vaccine to administer exclusively to plasma donors for HBIG production. Crucially, purification was not critical, since donors came from marginalized populations already infected with hepatitis anyway. Donors were vaccinated 6 times, followed by repeated boosters to keep antibody levels high. Merck identified this vaccine given to donors as the starting material, to which the rigorous 3-chemical purification was added to kill any known virus before it reached the general public. Since Offit and Fauci admit the blood Merck used as source material was, quote, heavily contaminated with HIV, One would logically expect gay men in San Francisco who donated plasma to contract HIV that same year. Remember, Dr. Dritz pointed out that's precisely what happened. However, Drs. Vyas and Prince could have improved yield with Prince's own vaccine. Recall, that same year, Prince detailed his simple techniques so that poor countries could make NYB-CB vax locally. Prince admitted it was highly controversial because he intentionally left viral material intact from the chimpanzee blood both to slash the cost of purification and to stimulate greater production of antibodies. Those antibodies are the very ingredient they began harvesting from gay men to make HBIG, precisely when and where HIV began spreading with explosive velocity among those donors. Here is a microscopic image of the chimpanzee viral material left in the final vaccine, which the CDC effectively used as a substitute for placebo in their control arm. In his patent, Prince explains that he used the pooled plasma of chimpanzees that had been injected with infected human plasma. Although human blood could be used, chimpanzee blood, he noted, offered a practical advantage because he could subject the apes to a specific protocol to induce chronic hepatitis infections. The exact method he used to induce that massive viral production is another overlooked and extremely critical point that we will cover shortly. The use of NYB-CB vax to hyperimmunize plasma donors is not speculative. On May 16, 1977, Prince wrote that it would
permit rapid expansion in present supplies of HBIG by stimulation of plasmapheresis donors.
Remember, Prince's colleague, Stevens, admitted that the first known HIV-positive gay man was one of their donors, part of the New York cohort, whose blood had become infected during a September 6th harvesting, barely 90 days later. The way Stevens and the CDC set aside their trial's placebo control arms and instead compared against the cohorts who were also vaccinated perfectly demonstrates Del Bigtree's whiskey study analogy. Whiskey makers prove their product does not cause car accidents by comparing it against a placebo control group, while hiding the fact that the placebo was actually vodka. Prince also collaborated with a center in Los Angeles that similarly vaccinated their plasma donors. Although the cohorts were entirely HIV negative when HBIG production began, within 1 year of using these vaccines to manufacture it by continuously hyperimmunizing plasma donors in New York City, San Francisco, and Los Angeles.
AIDS appeared suddenly and almost simultaneously in several metropolitan areas of the United States. Homosexual men living in New York City, San Francisco, and Los Angeles.
I have immense respect for the exhaustive research in the origin of AIDS by Canadian Dr. Jacques Pepin. Dr. Pepin is widely credited with cementing the mainstream narrative, but he acknowledges when that requires leaps of faith. He repeatedly expresses frustration that his U.S. counterparts refused to acknowledge the obvious spread of HIV during plasma harvesting. He is clearly unaware they had to pretend plasma donation posed no risk because they were using those donors as a substitute for their trial's placebo control arm to rule out vaccine transmission. He meticulously draws the dots, implicating those vaccines, but doesn't connect them, assuming American health officials were also acting in good faith.
Start with Marilyn. Pepin confirms she was a chimpanzee imported to the US for these NASA experiments, likely born around 1958 in Cameroon, the origin of HIV. She carries the oldest sequenced viral strain, which Pepin places in the middle of HIV's viral tree. Air Force scientists discovered that these chimpanzees were injected with pooled human blood upon capture, and proposed that the chimps were simply transient carriers of human hepatitis virus, already circulating in Cameroon. Pepin confirms HIV was also circulating in Cameroon at the time. Therefore, in addition to the chimpanzees' ancestral strains, some of these chimps could have been transient carriers, co-infected with the contemporary HIV strains already circulating among humans in Cameroon. In the US, Marilyn was used in experiments between 1966 and 1969. However, Pepin fails to mention they were done by Prince, who explained at the time.
The use of chimpanzee plasma as an alternate source for HBIG is under consideration. Chimpanzee gamma globulin could represent a logical source for protective antibody for human use.
Pepin reports that HIV entered the US via New York in 1969, but he doesn't connect the dots to Prince's use of that HIV-positive chimpanzee plasma for hepatitis control experiments in that same city in that same year. In addition to HBIG, Prince also extracted viral antigen from this chimp blood, and in 1971 wrote,
Drug addicts should be an ideal source of antibody-containing plasma by hyperimmunization of donors with antigen preparations.
Remember, Prince described doing the same thing to gay men in May 1977, 3 months before one of his donors became the first HIV-positive gay man. And his antigen preparations were branded NYBC-BVAX and widely used across sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. It's the same formulation the WHO continued sourcing at the factory that Prince set up in Myanmar following Bill Gates's funding. If this spread HIV in all those communities for 4 decades, then HIV infections would have occurred even earlier for drug addicts, specifically in New York in 1971, 6 years before gay men. In the first edition of his book, Pepin admitted that is precisely what happened, noting US drug addicts were infected even earlier than gay men. Initially, everyone, including Dr. Fauci, agreed infection logically aligned with symptom onset. New York drug users were the first, dying of, quote, junkie pneumonia and giving birth to infected babies as early as 1973. Gay men followed 5 years later, with Haitian refugees in Florida emerging as the third group. But Pepin's second edition erased that inconvenient chronology. He inverted the timeline, claiming infections happened in the exact opposite order of symptom onset. He proposes gay men on sex tourism holidays in Haiti brought the virus back and infected the drug users, without explaining why drug users were dying of AIDS years before the first gay man showed a symptom. Before chimpanzees and drug users, Prince had another antigen source. Offit suggests Prince should have won a Nobel Prize for figuring out how to get the vaccine's antigens from patients after a transfusion. Prince's patients were aged 3, 5, and 9 at the Willowbrook State School. The transfusion was an intentional injection of blood containing live hepatitis. Scientists from Dr. Fauci's agency acknowledged Prince's volunteers died from the process, leading to changing social mores that resulted in postponement of the vaccine's development until they came up with the chimpanzee model. That refers to a crusade by Robert F. Kennedy Sr. to halt the practice. In response, Stanley Plotkin, known as the godfather of vaccines, defended injecting those children with viruses to harvest vaccine source material. He argued they were not potential contributors to society, calling those children, most with Down syndrome, human in form but not in social potential. However, because the FDA required the use of human blood for the US market, the industry was forced to also seek out more human donors who would not trigger public outrage. 1 year after the New York and California cohorts targeted gay men, Florida identified another demographic that could be harvested without consequence: Haitian refugees, known as boat people. Florida became the third state to create a hepatitis B study cohort. Yet again, opposite demographics, identical outcomes.
But then in the fall of 1981, the mystery became even more ominous when the disease was also diagnosed in otherwise healthy immigrants from Haiti, men who were neither homosexual nor drug users.
The CDC referred to these first groups with AIDS as the 3 H's. Every early case among gay men was limited to New York and California, while every early Haitian case was found in Florida. In every community, every archived blood sample was HIV negative when the cohorts were established. In each case, symptoms emerged in just 12 to 24 months, bypassing the standard 10-year asymptomatic window when transmission is sexual. This pattern repeated as the hepatitis studies expanded to Zambia, South Africa, India, and Thailand. Remember, Zambia's cohort also archived blood samples, providing a definitive baseline when they began. All were HIV negative, and 2 years later, Zambian hospitals were overflowing with AIDS cases. The plasma industry established harvesting operations alongside these cohorts, where health officials tested the community, serving as taxpayer-funded recruiters, funneling the infected to the centers for collection. Nearly every page of the nation's leading gay magazines featured ads offering cash for plasma. They were harvesting both the donor's own antibodies to make HBIG, which required continuous hyperimmunization with the experimental vaccines, and also the live virus's antigens to make the upcoming commercial vaccine. Most operations targeted gay men and ran alongside the New York and California cohorts. Gamma Dynamics set up shop alongside the Florida cohort in Pompano Beach, Florida, known as Little Haiti, the beach where Haitian boats came ashore. Gamma Dynamics said they hoped to make a killing selling the refugees' infected plasma to Merck. The CDC confirmed boat people had the highest rates of hepatitis. They were also the poorest demographic in the hemisphere. The CEO of the plasma processor, David Gurey, volunteered at the South Florida Haiti Project. Notably, the highest per capita rate of AIDS in the country was in the farming community of Belle Glade, just 40 miles away, where those Haitian refugees worked as manual laborers. Dr. Fauci argued Haitians were simply closeted homosexuals. Yet, before 1981, there were 0 cases in the large Haitian enclave of New York, the epicenter of the outbreak in gay men, nor in the substantial Haitian communities of Canada and France. Every early Haitian case appeared exclusively among Florida refugees. The CDC's Dr. Castro investigated.
You were certainly involved in several higher-profile, very visible investigations, one of which was situated in the city of Belle Glade in Florida.
And the investigators had described a number of cases of AIDS in the city of Belle Glade and claimed that the majority of them did not have risk factors, and were speculating that maybe insects were transmitting HIV, not unlike so many other arboviral infections. So we ended up quickly ascertaining that the majority of the so-called no identified risk individuals had indeed other well-established risk factors.
The other well-established risk factor in Dr. Castro's paper is simply having had heterosexual contact at any point with another Haitian, even without any evidence that the partner was actually infected. The paper assumes AIDS was so rampant in Haitian communities that any heterosexual contact with a Haitian guaranteed infection. Yet, it ignores the obvious question. Why did this exclusively affect refugees who had recently arrived in Florida? Furthermore, half had been married, and only 3 had passed the virus to their spouses, showing the inefficiency of heterosexual transmission even among Haitians. Also, none of the children were infected, which directly contradicts their assumption that HIV had long been circulating in Haiti. Blood tests confirmed. American scientists tested all archived blood samples and more than 800 autopsy samples from unusual deaths in Haiti before the U.S. outbreak. They concluded that AIDS did not exist in Haiti prior to the year those vaccinated Florida refugees would have returned following deportation. By the time of Castro's investigation, it was already established that HIV was present in the blood that Prince had used to make the vaccine given to donors. Castro's team did investigate possible transmission by mosquitoes, lice, mites, fleas, bedbugs, sunlight, insect repellent, etc. Anything but the vaccine which many AIDS patients blamed. Ironically, the CDC could see the FDA's blind spots with Factor VIII, yet not their own with vaccines.
Entity in the FDA was heavily influenced by the blood banking members. And at that meeting I did refer to, I think, as ostrich-like behavior. It's like I don't want to hear about those cases.
At the end of 1982, 3 months after AIDS was recognized, Guri and other plasma harvesters were required to sign certifications that they had halted the process. But they only halted it in the United States. The operations simply relocated overseas. A leading blood expert later noted that AIDS outbreaks in developing countries correlated exactly with the arrival of those plasma facilities. While Dr. Pepin endorses the narrative that HIV migrated in the 1960s from Africa to Haiti to New York's gay community, he admits the flaws. None of the Haitians who returned from Africa developed AIDS, and Haiti was a major supplier of blood plasma to make U.S. pharmaceuticals in the early 1970s. Reportedly, not one of the 6,000 Haitians who donated plasma before the U.S. outbreak was infected. Factor VIII was made from the pooled plasma of thousands of donors and would have transmitted the virus to hemophiliacs if any of the donors were infected. Yet that didn't happen until after plasma from U.S. gay men became infected in 1977. Pepin speculates that perhaps Haitian plasma was used exclusively for other products, which were subjected to viral inactivation. Yet, if Factor VIII wasn't being made from Haitian plasma, then it would have had to be made from the other major plasma source at the time, gay men. If even 0.1% of gay men had been infected in 1976, the statistical probability of any given Factor VIII lot transmitting the virus would be around 90%. Since the thousands of pre-1977 lots were entirely uncontaminated, the books claim that New York gay men imported the virus from Haiti around 1971 appears mathematically impossible. Remember, HIV was definitely circulating among the New York drug addicts Prince used as test subjects. But they were all hepatitis carriers. The nation's blood supply remained completely HIV-free as long as they were as welcome as Typhoid Mary in blood banks. Once they were no longer excluded in 1977, around 90% of hemophiliacs who received Factor VIII lots made from blood collected after that point died of AIDS. In 1984, the year HIV was discovered, and Fauci was appointed to lead the response, before even one case had been identified in Africa that predated the US outbreak. Fauci already laid out the narrative that would get funding.
Let me tell you another fact. In the late 60s and early 70s, thousands, not a few, but thousands of Haitians came to Zaire, particularly in Kinshasa, the capital, to work as technical advisors for the Zairean government. After several years there, because of the nationalization of much of the industry, they were essentially kicked out of Zaire and came back to Haiti, to the United States, and to Canada. Is that a possible connection? The answer is yes, because it is very likely that the male homosexuals in New York City, who frequently travel to Port-au-Prince in Haiti for vacations and for sexual contacts down there, picked up the virus in Haiti.
Fauci knew that was impossible when he said it. He had already reported that New York drug users were giving birth to infected babies before the nationalization program was even announced on November 30th, 1973. Besides, his scientists reported that the surge in cases in Kinshasa had to be very recent because the virus appeared almost entirely in babies less than 12 months old. Few children over 1 were infected. Further, exclusively in hospital settings, half of the infected children had uninfected mothers. The surge in Kinshasa correlated with the opening of a plasma harvesting center, not a sudden change in sexual behavior. However, when promoting his book, Dr. Pepin claimed evidence ultimately vindicated Fauci's narrative.
We suggest that this exportation from Haiti to the U.S. occurred through sexual tourism.
Haiti's tourism-based economy collapsed when Fauci transformed their image from tropical paradise to Chernobyl of the Caribbean. However, Pepin concedes that all of the actual physical evidence supported Haitian scientists' claims that HIV circulated in the U.S. before Haiti, and that Fauci's Haiti First model became established when
molecular biologists came to the rescue of historians.
He appears to refer to his co-author, Andrew Rambo. In 2020, Rambo received a private message calling it so friggin' likely that COVID-19 originated from the Wuhan lab. Rambo replied,
"The truth is never going to come out. Given the shit show that would happen if anyone serious accused the Chinese of even accidental release, we are content with ascribing it to natural processes."
One claim in Dr. Pepin's book is demonstrably false. He wrote,
"There is no documentary evidence that chimpanzee cells were ever used anywhere in the world to produce any vaccine targeting viral infections."
Visit openlibrary.org, enter this ID, and go to page 10. At that WHO symposium, in front of thousands, global health leaders reported their patients were, quote, immunized with chimpanzee cells. They also used chimpanzee blood to prime heart-lung machines for patients of blood type O, and surgically connected patients to tranquilize chimpanzees of the same blood type to use them as living dialysis machines. These appear to be genuine oversights because Dr. Pepin's book is refreshingly honest in highlighting the glaring holes in the mainstream narrative, though he didn't realize that vaccine transmission perfectly fills them. He wrote,
At least 30 million doses of such crude vaccines were administered before they were replaced by genetically engineered vaccines, which eliminated all risk of infection. The early hepatitis B vaccines were not incriminated in the transmission of HIV either. Presumably, the methods used to inactivate HBV were effective against HIV as well.
Recall they were administered hundreds of millions of times, and Myanmar's crude vaccine was still in use 30 years after Merck added pepsin and urea to address concerns. Perhaps Dr. Pepin will revisit this conclusion once he hears the answer. The scientific community has never proposed an explanation for a baffling enigma. When an HIV blood test became available, it turned out many early cases weren't infected. Something else had wiped out their immune system. It was called HIV-negative AIDS.
HIV was never present by any means in all cases of AIDS, but Anthony Fauci made sure that there was a perfect correlation by eliminating about 5,000 HIV-negative AIDS cases. There was a conference in Amsterdam in the early 1990s, an AIDS conference. Doctors started to go to the podium in a session where they were talking about HIV-negative AIDS, and they began to say, yeah, I have some too. I have a clinical AIDS patient, has every symptom, but tests negative on every test, no matter how many times they test. And so there was a clamor, there was a sense of anxiety. Wait a minute, what is this? Could it be that Peter Duesberg is right? And Anthony Fauci flew in on Air Force Two to that conference, and he did his thing, and he quashed it. He just quashed it. He gave a statement through Newsweek that this just wasn't an issue, it was a misunderstanding. And what they did at that moment was they took all of the HIV-negative AIDS cases and they renamed them and threw them out of the official definition.
In a brazen move to explain away the anomaly of AIDS without HIV, Dr. Fauci declared that the unexplained AIDS cases represented a new disease. To avoid suspicion that his, quote, new disease, end quote, was, after all, chronic fatigue syndrome, Dr. Fauci labeled his discovery idiopathic CD4 plus lymphocytopenia, or ICL. In this tongue twister, idiopathic means of unknown source. I do not know whether HIV/AIDS was the thing that was the force that killed all of these people in the 80s and 90s. What we do know is that there was a deliberate, purposeful effort that was orchestrated by Tony Fauci, a crusade to silence dissidents, to make sure the debate didn't happen, to make sure that science that challenged the official orthodoxy was suppressed, that people who voiced that science had their careers destroyed, that they were silenced, that they were vilified, that they were marginalized, that they were ridiculed, that they were made radioactive.
A logical, albeit sinister, explanation for HIV-negative AIDS emerges when you follow the money for the hepatitis B vaccine. It's here in the research papers from the FDA scientists who helped invent the vaccine's chimpanzee model with Fauci's scientists and run the vaccine trials in southern Africa. They also held 5 patents related to the vaccine and stood to get a cut of the sales. One problem kept them from cashing in. Even though the CDC reported that Haitian boat people had the highest rates of hepatitis by far, the Florida plasma harvester recruiting them reported that only 15 out of every 3,000 potential donors naturally produced usable quantities of the hepatitis B surface antigen. Remember, for this reason, Prince found chimpanzees offered the practical advantage because he could subject them to a protocol to induce chronic hepatitis infections. To make a killing, plasma harvesters needed to do it to human donors. The FDA scientists who held the patents and whose financial interests aligned explained the protocol.
Immunosuppression with cyclophosphamide predisposed donors to chronic production of hepatitis B surface antigen.
Even without HIV, cyclophosphamide leads to immune system collapse and Kaposi's sarcoma within just 4 months. The evidence of this practice is hiding in plain sight. Remember, all but one of the 40 early cases were patrons of bathhouses where plasma harvesters operated, and all of the men manifested symptoms within 7 to 14 months. And some yet unknown agent was causing the HIV-negative AIDS that Fauci renamed ICL. Plasma harvesters had a strong and perverse financial incentive to surreptitiously inject donors with immunosuppressive drugs so that their immune systems would stop fighting the hepatitis virus. That would allow the virus to establish permanent replication in the donors' livers, thus creating a copious supply of the highly profitable viral antigens that harvesters hoped to make a killing selling to Merck. Harvesters referred to their donors as plasma cows. Yet legal proceedings established that, purely for financial gain, these same FDA officials allowed Qatar and other plasma harvesters to sacrifice even upstanding citizens.
Why is Bayer Corporation the rat of the week? Internal documents show that after this company positively, absolutely knew that they had a medication that was infected with the AIDS virus, they took the product off the market in the U.S. and then they dumped it in France, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The medicine's called Factor VIII. It was an injection medicine that was used for hemophiliacs, mostly children. Children had been born with an...
Hold on, Mike. So hold on. So you're telling me that Bayer knew that this drug was infected with the AIDS virus. They yanked it from the market in America, and then they dumped it in markets overseas?
They had to figure out a way, Joe, to make a profit on a product that they could not sell in America. So they made a huge profit. They dropped the product in Japan, Spain, and France. By the way, Joe, government officials in France that allowed that to happen actually had to go to prison for it. In America, not one corporate executive for this company has been indicted or even criminally investigated by our Justice Department.
Why not? What, you're telling me that these people that dumped this AIDS-tainted blood in foreign countries who killed children have not been taken to task in the United States?
It's worse than that. The U.S. government allowed it to happen. The FDA allowed this to happen. And now the government is completely looking the other way. Thousands of innocent hemophiliacs have died from the AIDS virus. And not only they're dying, their family members are dying because they're becoming infected.
Edward Tabor and Robert Geraghty were the FDA scientists regulating the industry, rolling out the vaccine in southern Africa, and they held the patents. After they brought the rate of new HIV infections to extremely low levels in the US by halting blood-based transmission, they released this bulletin audaciously claiming that AIDS had never been documented to be transmitted by blood. They urged hemophiliacs to continue buying life-saving Factor VIII, 1 year after privately warning the makers that it was causing AIDS. They defended the costly 3-chemical purification of Hepatit-B and began claiming this $400 vaccine was what they had rolled out in poor rural African villages.
But the blood bankers were not change agents, and that's true in Canada, in the United States, and elsewhere. And the regulators were really blood bankers regulating blood bankers, because why would you need regulation in blood banking? These are good people trying their best. And as a result, thousands of people died around the world. I think the money trail in blood banking, it really has a couple of chapters or pieces. One is the plasma side of blood banking, where you donate plasma that is made into a variety of things, not blood, whole blood, but just the plasma itself, where, frankly, at least in the United States, you pay donors to, you put a needle in, you take the blood out, you give the cells back, and you keep the plasma. That ended up to be a very dangerous thing because
James Tullis patented plasma collection and confirmed he wrote his own regulation. When the immunodeficiency emerged, he speculated that they may have injected the, quote, donors who constitute human factories with slow viruses. HIV is a lentivirus, Latin for slow virus. However, he justified this with the greater good argument.
On a cost-benefit basis, the tremendous value which these agents have for the control of various diseases seems to outweigh the hazard. But how does one explain this conclusion to the so-called informed donor who is the one who is at risk?
None of the plasma harvesters admitted to administering immunosuppressive drugs. However, they admit they put donors at risk without informed consent. And this explains how they somehow obtained the large volume of plasma needed to make a killing, precisely when their donors began suffering an immune system collapse that remains an unsolved mystery. The full proceedings for the 1981 symposium in New York were only available in libraries. They contain a bombshell. Remember, Offit warned us this vaccine used the most dangerous starting material, and Fauci said you have the responsibility that you might do harm. These proceedings reveal that Fauci's own agency was also taking stabs at making a vaccine from this most dangerous starting material. Yet they designed the trial in a way that it would be impossible to know if the vaccine killed the participants. They released this list of all the vaccines being tested in 1980 using that plasma they now admit was heavily contaminated with HIV. None, not even Hillerman's, used his 3-chemical purification. Thus, by their own admission, all of them carried a high risk of transmitting HIV. Here's Cutter's. Here's Prince's Chimpvax. Here's Fauci's. His human trials began in 1977. However, Fauci's scientists struggled to inactivate deadly viruses without harming the antigens needed for the vaccine to work. They reported early lots generated less immune response in man than in chimpanzees. In an attempt to improve the immunogenicity, they experimented with various formulations. One was tested on young medical staff in Texas, mostly students. Half received the vaccine, half received a placebo. Yet, even though all participants were heterosexuals at low risk for hepatitis, and thus had little need for the vaccine anyway, just a couple of months into the trial, they vaccinated the entire placebo arm. 10 years later, many medical staff did indeed have AIDS. It was generally dismissed as an occupational hazard from needle sticks. But for Fauci's vaccine, there was no long-term follow-up. And even if there had been, and high rates of AIDS were found, the placebo control arm had been unnecessarily vaccinated, making it impossible to separate causation from correlation. This perfectly demonstrates why skeptics demand true placebo-controlled trials with long-term follow-up, and it explains why the industry is so fiercely opposed to them. Had a true long-term vaccinated versus unvaccinated comparison been made, it might have revealed that Fauci's own vaccine gave AIDS to young, healthy medical students. This explains why Offit violently opposes placebo-controlled trials, calling them cruel. He is adamant that all vaccine trials use an existing vaccine in lieu of placebo as the control arm. He argues it would be unethical for some participants to get a placebo offering no protection. However, during the trial of the original rotavirus vaccine, which Offit co-invented, there was no existing vaccine, so he was required to use a placebo. Per the package insert, 25 children died after receiving his vaccine, most from unexplainable sudden infant death. If the rate had been lower in the placebo control arm, Offit would have lost his $182 million licensing deal with Merck, who would have also had to write off another $350 million for the trial. They were saved purely because there were a similar number of deaths in the placebo control arm. But it took a Freedom of Information Act request to reveal his trial design ensured their $500 million was never at risk. That's because Offit's placebo contained all the same potentially dangerous ingredients as the vaccine. That even included the animal tissue culture medium, the very ingredient in Qatar's polio vaccine that killed all those children and caused one of the worst biological disasters. Thus, it's impossible to prove if Offit's vaccine was responsible for all those unexplainable deaths during his trial. This man's daughter died within 24 hours of receiving the vaccine. He brought a book blaming this on the trial's lack of a true placebo control arm. He tried to speak to Offit during a live video podcast.
Hi.
Hey,
Hey, guys.
that's my daughter.
Oh, he's laughing.
In it, we'd like to talk.
Can we come in? Can we come in? We brought a book. They pulled a shade.
My daughter died within 24 hours of routine vaccinations.
Watch their reaction inside the studio.
We have the Dark Lord of vaccines, the person that the anti-vaxxers hate so much, and the reason they hate him is that he saves lives every single day through communication, through vaccine development, through science promotion, and through being an amazing superstar. Everybody, you're not gonna believe it, it's Dr. Paul Offit. Wait, look at this. It's an anti-vax protester.
Oh, is that okay?
Yeah, this is not a joke. They're actually anti-vax activists outside the window right now. And now they're gone because Tom turned them off. This is what we want to talk about too. You hear him?
Yeah, what is he saying exactly?
I don't know, but Tom's gonna make sure that the door is locked and also that Logan's gun is cocked. You spend 25 years of your life developing a vaccine that saves lives. That saves, I think it's been estimated, hundreds of lives a day because rotavirus kills children. You do this, you're a passionate advocate for science, you're a pediatrician, you're a good human being, you're a lovely introverted person who in 5 minutes I loved talking to, and you get this as a reward.
Offit confirmed the vaccine debate comes down to placebo-controlled trials.
So, Paul, you start the piece with a statement made by anti-vaccine activists, quote, government officials, pharmaceutical companies, public health agencies, scientists, and doctors are lying to you about vaccines. So, first of all, I can't imagine all of them conspiring to lie in the same way. That scientists don't even agree. But given that, what are they lying about, and do people really believe that?
I certainly think there is a group of people in this country who do believe the anti-vaccine activists and their tropes. The thinking behind this claim is that vaccine trials are not really placebo-controlled. So therefore, because the placebo itself may be dangerous, then you can't really tell whether the vaccine is dangerous. And therefore, all vaccines might be dangerous. I mean, that's where they're coming from. Sadly, they can get at least a subset of people in this country to believe them because we're living in an age where conspiracy theories are no longer marginal. In this country to believe them because we're living in an age where conspiracy theories are no longer marginal.
It takes just 60 seconds to prove that everyone, everywhere, really is demonstrably lying about the hepatitis B vaccine safety signal which we examined. Search. What date did the CDC use the term AIDS for the first time? You will find a universal consensus. September 24th, 1982. This interview with Anthony Fauci states it clearly. On September 24th, 1982, the CDC applied a name to the new disease, AIDS. Universities repeat the date, as does the BBC and the Australian government. The US government website confirms. Now, look at this CDC index. Here is the September 24th bulletin, introducing it as a purely sexually transmitted disease, with no mention of vaccines or blood. Scroll back 21 days to the bulletin entitled Hepatitis B Virus Vaccine Safety. 3 weeks before everyone insists the acronym was first used, the CDC wrote the disease, quote, is now called Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome, AIDS. Done. Yes, they are all lying. About something as obvious as the date of the bulletin. Today, it's the man with a video claiming the date was September 3rd who is right. All the scientists claiming September 24th are wrong. Even the CDC denies the existence of their very own September 3rd bulletin, presumably because it proves that, even before the disease had a name, the CDC had already figured out that it was caused by a virus in the blood plasma used to make the vaccine, and that it had somehow slipped through chimpanzee safety testing. There's no mention of sexual transmission, because the common link was plasma, not sex. It was previously called the 4H disease. The first 3 H's were vaccine plasma donors, the fourth recipients, so this
suggests an unidentified and uncharacterized bloodborne agent. Infectious agents that might be present in donor plasma are most likely to be viruses. Virus transmission by blood or blood products.
Over the 21 days that followed, they came up with a more convenient narrative blaming the victims, and reintroduced it on September 24th as a sexually transmitted disease. Their first introduction of AIDS is named after the vaccine. They defend the FDA-licensed version, which added pepsin and urea, but include this awkward disclaimer about a difference in the early lots used in placebo-controlled trials on gay men. Anybody who sees this bulletin would naturally demand an answer to the keystone question. So the fact that all these scientists who administered the vaccine deny that the September 3rd bulletin exists demonstrates George Carlin's point.
You don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge. These people...